The keel of the small wooden boat groaned against the white sand of Futuna. Peter Chanel stepped over the gunwale, his boots sinking into the wet grit of the shoreline. He stood upright, the humid air pressing against his skin like a heavy blanket. He carried only a wooden cross and a satchel. Across the beach, the tree line shifted. A dozen men emerged from the dense foliage, their movements synchronized and silent. They stopped at the edge of the sand. Every warrior held a spear pointed toward the ground, but their eyes remained fixed on Peter. They did not blink. Peter took a step forward, his hands empty, and bowed his head in a gesture of peace. He offered a smile, but the gesture met only stone-faced stillness. One of the warriors shifted his grip on his spear, the wood scraping against his palm. The tension stretched, thin and sharp, vibrating in the humid air. Instead, the warriors turned in unison. They retreated into the shadows of the jungle, their feet leaving deep, rhythmic prints in the sand. Peter dragged palm fronds from the forest edge to a clearing near the shore. He lashed the leaves to a frame of driftwood, his fingers working the knots until they bled. By sunset, the shack stood a fragile, low structure that offered little protection from the island heat. Each morning, he walked toward the village, his path marked by the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. He would find the elders sitting in the central clearing, their backs turned toward his approach. When he spoke, the air remained undisturbed. No one met his gaze. He tried to offer medicine to a woman coughing in the shade, but she pulled her children away, her eyes darting toward the trees as if he were a ghost. He returned to the shore every evening, the silence of the island pressing into his ears. He sat on the sand, watching the horizon. While the village fires flickered in the distance, unreachable and cold, he wrote letters by the light of a small oil lamp, his quill scratching against parchment, the only sound in the vast, empty night. He was a man surrounded by people, yet he existed in a vacuum. The island had decided he did not exist. Peter shifted his focus from the silence to the work. He spent his days at the water's edge, where the local fishermen left their broken nets tangled in the surf. He pulled the frayed fibers apart, his fingers raw and calloused, and knotted them back into functional strength. He left the mended nets folded neatly on the rocks, but the fishermen never thanked him. They would arrive, see the repairs, and carry the nets away without a glance. When he walked through the village with a basket of his own meager rations, the reaction was sharper. He would set the food down near the hungry, then back away. A stone skidded across the dirt, striking the wooden frame of his door with a dull thud. Another followed, kicking up dust at his feet. He did not flinch. He did not shout back. He simply turned and walked toward his shack, his pace steady and unhurried. He spent his nights cleaning the grit from his skin and preparing for the next day of labor. He did not count the converts he failed to win. Instead, he counted the days he remained present, the days he kept his hands moving, and the days he refused to let the hostility dictate his purpose. The rhythm of the island changed when the king arrived. He did not walk, he marched, his presence drawing the villagers from their huts to watch from the shadows. He stopped before the shack, his face marked with lines of red ochre that looked like jagged scars in the afternoon light. He raised his heavy staff and slammed it into the dry earth with a force that sent a tremor through the ground. The sound echoed against the palm walls. He shouted, his voice a guttural roar that denounced the new faith as a rot, a poison meant to dismantle the traditions of his people. Peter stepped out. He did not raise his head. He kept his hands folded deep within his sleeves, his posture still and unyielding. The king stepped closer, his chest heaving, his eyes locked onto Peter with a predatory intensity. He leaned down, spat at Peter's feet, and waited for a defense. Peter offered none. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to the ground. He knelt in the dust, his head bowed, his body a silent anchor in the center of the king's storm. The king turned, his staff dragging in the sand, and retreated, leaving Peter alone in the quiet, settling dust. The isolation deepened, yet the work remained. Peter was mending a net when a shadow fell across his workspace. It was the king's son. The boy stood stiffly, his arm held tight against his side, a jagged, angry gash weeping blood onto the sand. He did not speak, but his eyes tracked Peter's hands with a mixture of pain and guarded curiosity. Peter did not ask how it happened. He set the net aside, moved to his water jar, and poured a clean stream over the wound. He used a strip of cloth, his movements precise and gentle, binding the injury until the bleeding stopped. The boy winced, then exhaled, his shoulders dropping for the first time. He left as quickly as he had come, leaving behind only the scent of salt and dried blood. The next day, the boy returned. He sat just outside the door, watching Peter work. By the third day, he began to ask questions. Peter spoke in the local dialect, telling stories that had nothing to do with the king's laws and everything to do with the mercy he practiced. The boy listened, his gaze fixed. The king's rage did not arrive with a shout. It arrived with the sound of heavy footsteps in the tall grass. The secret visits had ended. That night, the air grew thick with the smell of burning resin. Peter sat inside his hut, the silence of the evening shattered by the rhythmic thud of spears against the earth. He looked toward the door as the first orange flicker danced across the palm fronds. Outside, the darkness was being pushed back by a ring of torches. Warriors stood in a tight, suffocating circle, their faces obscured by the shifting light and shadow. The king stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the entrance, his jaw set in a line of absolute resolve. Peter stood up. He moved toward the threshold, his movements slow and deliberate. As he pushed the door open, the heat of the torches washed over him, stinging his skin. He spread his arms wide, exposing his chest to the wall of steel and fire. He stood motionless, meeting the raw, violent energy with a terrifying, absolute peace. The king did not hesitate. He gestured, and the circle tightened. A heavy wooden club swung through the air, the sound of its arc cutting through the stillness. It caught Peter squarely on the shoulder. He staggered, the impact forcing a sharp intake of breath, but he did not fall. He remained upright, his gaze steady, his arms still held wide. A second blow struck his temple. The world tilted. The sand rushed up to meet him as his knees buckled. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his frame, and the darkness he had navigated for so long finally claimed him. His blood seeped into the dry earth, a dark, spreading stain. The warriors stood frozen, their weapons half raised, the momentum of their rage dying in the sudden absence of resistance. The torches hissed, the only sound in the clearing. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence was absolute. The torches burned down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows that danced over the sand. The warriors had vanished into the tree line, leaving the clearing to the wind and the sea. For a long time, the only movement was the slow crawl of the tide. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the king's son. He walked to the spot where the earth was stained, his movements stiff and deliberate. He knelt, his fingers tracing the ground where the man had fallen. He began to speak. His voice was thin at first, then steady, recounting the days of healing and the stories he had been told. He spoke of the hands that had bound his wounds and the words that had offered him peace. From the edge of the jungle, the villagers emerged. They moved slowly, their eyes fixed on the boy, their spears discarded in the grass. They gathered in a wide, trembling circle. One by one, they stepped forward, kneeling in the sand. They touched the earth, feeling the grit and the dampness, their faces etched with a sudden heavy clarity. The transformation did not arrive with thunder, but with the quiet rhythm of daily life. Within months, the shoreline where the blood had soaked into the sand became a place of gathering. The villagers, once defined by their suspicion, now stood in long, orderly lines. They came to the water, not with spears, but with open palms. The rites of baptism replaced the old rituals of exclusion. Where there had once been a fortress of resistance, a sanctuary of faith emerged, built upon the ground that witnessed the final act of defiance. The king's son remained a constant presence, his voice carrying the stories he had learned in the small palm frond shack. The islanders cleared the paths that Peter had once walked alone, turning them into communal walkways. They shared their harvests, their medicine, and their time, mirroring the quiet labor of the man they had once cast out. Years passed, and the memory of the events solidified into the bedrock of their culture. The life of Peter Chanel was not measured by numbers, but by the harvest that bloomed from the seed he had buried in the dust. The island stood as a living witness to a man who gave everything, proving that a single life can alter the course of an entire people.